What's up everybody and welcome to this video. Today I will tell you about the biggest mistake that I have done using my drone, the DJI Mavic Air. I've made a video once complaining about the picture quality of this little drone here. You can check it up here if you wish. And sure, you can never get the same picture quality out of this tiny sensor compared to a bigger sensor of a full frame or crop sensor camera or even micro four thirds. But there's actually something you can do to maximize the picture quality in this drone. And this doesn't only go for this drone, but it goes for any kind of camera, to be honest. And what you can do, at least in theory, is consider the bitrates that you are recording with and how those bitrates relate to the frames per second that you are recording with. So yeah, basically you want to consider bitrates to get the most out of your drone or any camera. What is a bitrate? This is where I can put it. It's the amount of information your camera can record onto your SD card per second. It usually is indicated by Mbps, which stands for megabits per second. Now this per second part is where it gets interesting, because as you know, your camera does also have something called frames per second, which means how many frames your camera records per second. And now let's make some easy mathematics. Let's assume your camera has two different modes that both record at 60 megabits per second. One would be 180p at 30 frames per second, the other one would be 180p at 60 frames per second. So doing some simple mathematics, at 1080p 30 fps you will get 2 megabits per frame, while at 1080p 60 fps you will get 1 megabit per frame. Now does that mean that recording at 1080p 30 fps instead of 1080p 60 fps will give you double the picture quality? Well, not exactly, and that's because of the way the codecs work. For example, they record the same information over different frames, so you cannot compare it exactly one to one. But what you can say is that when you are recording at the same resolution using the same codec in your camera, and if your camera uses the same bitrate for different settings of FPS, then the lower the FPS, the better the picture quality will be. I want to give you two bits of information regarding codecs, no pun intended. But if you don't care about that, you can skip ahead to this minute and we will get to the conclusion over there. Which codec you are using makes a big difference in this comparison. By that I mean you can compare the bitrates of two different cameras directly if you don't know their codecs. Using the same codec and the same FPS, the higher bitrate will always yield a better picture quality. But using a newer codec like H.265 compared to H.264 will yield you a better quality at the same codec and same FPS, and even give you a better picture quality if the bitrate is a little bit lower. On the other hand, there's a reason you might not want higher bitrates, because a higher bitrate leads to bigger file sizes. For example, a constant 20 megabits per second video recording for 30 minutes will give you a video of 36,000 megabits, which is 4,500 megabytes or 4.5 gigabytes. If you go up to 100 megabits per second, your video file size will increase to 22.5 gigabytes. So basically using a 5 times higher bitrate will give you 5 times the bigger file size. This means you might prefer a lower bitrate if storage is an issue, or maybe if you have a slower computer that has a hard time handling bigger file sizes. I have talked a lot so far, but let me get back to the mistake I did using my DJI Mavic Air. You can guess it by now, I didn't consider bitrates when filming my drone footage. Most of the time I used 2.7K at 60 FPS when filming drone footage, and that was for one single reason. No, the reason wasn't so that I could slow down the footage. Usually when I film something with my drone, I speed up the footage in post. No, the main reason was just exposure. DJI Mavic Air doesn't have an aperture setting, and switching ND filters all the time is a bit tedious. And so I decided to use the shutter speed to set my exposure right. But so that I still followed the 180-degree rule, I would film in 60 FPS, so I could set the shutter speed to 1/125, which would give me more than one stop less exposure than using a shutter speed of 1/50 when filming at 24 FPS. And also back then I would edit all my footage at 1080p, so I didn't think it would matter if I filmed in 2.7K or 4K. We do all know that higher resolution usually give a better picture quality, but rarely consider that the reason that this happens is because higher resolutions have a better bitrate. For example, if you film 4K at 8 megabits per second, the picture quality will be worse than filming 1080p at 10 megabits per second. What usually matters is the bitrate, and the higher resolution will have a higher bitrate and give you therefore a better picture quality. The Mavic Air, for example, films 4K 24 to 30 FPS at 10 megabits per second. And if you go to 2.7K 60 FPS, it still does a respectable 90 megabits per second. But there lies a problem. With 2.7K 60 FPS at 90 megabits per second nets you 1.5 megabits per frame, while 4K 24 FPS at 100 megabits per second yields you 4.17 megabits per frame. It's almost 3 times more information recorded to the SD card. When you drop the frame rate at 2.7K down to 24 FPS, you will only get 50 megabits per second, which is exactly half the bitrate that you get at 4K 24. So that also means that you will get half the megabits per frame, which in this case is 2.08 megabits per frame. But still, those 2.08 megabits per frame that you get at 2.7K 24 FPS are 39% higher than the 1.5 megabits per frame that you get at 2.7K 60 FPS. So if you want to film at 2.7K, it's still better to film at 24 FPS instead of 60 FPS. That is if you don't need to slow down the footage in post. So basically, filming at 4K 24 FPS will yield you a better picture than at 2.7K at 24 FPS, even if you are editing in 2.7K, because a higher bitrate gives you a better picture quality and a better color gradability. That's all theoretical so far. The big question is, does it really matter in this case? Is there a noticeable difference in picture quality and color gradability? Or is it just numbers? And even if there is a difference in picture quality, will YouTube even be able to show the difference considering that it uses only 16 megabits per second at 1440p? I will now try to fly the drone over the same place 3 different times. Once with 4K 30 FPS, once with 2.7K 30 FPS, and once with 2.7K 60 FPS. I'm using those specific settings with everything else the same, and I'm also using 2 different ND filters to get the same exposure between 30 FPS and 60 FPS using the 180-degree rule. And in the end, I will edit this video in 1440p 30 FPS just to fit the lowest common denominator and also be within YouTube's optimal rules for resolution and FPS settings. All right, let's do it. Right, that was it, and it was really weird. I didn't have any problems with the first 2 settings, 4K 30 FPS and 2.7K 30 FPS. But then when I flew the drone back and changed the ND filter, the drone suddenly started to act up, and it didn't stay still anymore. It just kept changing the altitude the whole time, and I couldn't keep it at the right altitude anymore. So no idea how the last part of the footage, the 2.7K 60 FPS turned out. And I also don't know if there is any noticeable difference in picture quality. I guess we will see that back at home, all right? See you there. Welcome home. I think the first thing to do is to look at the footage without talking too much. Right, looking at the footage this way, there's not a big difference between the 3 shots, but I'm pretty sure that the 2.7K 60 FPS version is a little bit mushier than the other 2. But I want to look at it a little bit closer, so let me zoom into the waterfall first. And now let's look at the waterfall in the 3 shots side by side. Looking at it this way, it's pretty obvious that the 2.7K 60 FPS has a worse quality than the other 2. It has less detail, it's less sharp, it is mushier. I think it's pretty much obviously the worst candidate of the 3. But now looking at the other 2 shots, it's a bit more difficult to see a difference. If you're watching this on a small screen or a low resolution screen, you probably won't see a difference between the 2.7K 30 FPS and 4K 30 FPS. But looking at it on my 15-inch 4K screen, I can see that there are subtle differences. It's only subtle, it's not that obvious, it's not a big difference, so you could use both shots without any problem. But I see that on the stones beside the waterfall, for example, well, waterfall, calling it a waterfall, I don't know how else to call it. But yeah, you can see more detail in the 4K footage, especially the texture is a little bit clearer. Also the branch with the leaves in the foreground looks a tad sharper to me. And the branch and the leaves right above the waterfall are a little bit clearer in the 4K version. I think that you can make out a little bit more detail. But that might also be my imagination, because I know that it's 4K and it should be looking better. So you can use this footage to decide for yourselves, and let me know in the comments below what you think, if there's a difference between 4K 30 FPS and 2.7K 30 FPS. But to me it's pretty obvious that 2.7K 60 FPS, which I've mostly been using, is way worse than the other two options. I also wondered if YouTube would be able to display the differences seen here, considering that YouTube uses only 16 megabits per second at 1440p and only about 35 megabits per second, I think, at 4K. So I'm uploading a 1440p version and the 4K version to YouTube, so you can look at it yourselves and decide if there's even any point in recording in a higher bitrate for purely usage in YouTube. So what is my conclusion after all of this? Well, as I stated in the beginning and the title of this video, I did a big mistake using my DJI Mavic Air, because I didn't consider bitrates or megabits per frame. And that is something that I will certainly be considering more in the future when filming something, because if you want to get the most out of your camera, it's not always wise to use higher frames per second if it means loss of video quality. Specifically in this case, the DJI Mavic Air, filming at 2.7K 60 FPS is only worth it if you want to slow the footage down in post. But if that is not something you want to do and storage is not an issue, I would go for 4K 24 FPS, or if you are a 30 FPS shooter, of course go for 4K 30 FPS. I will certainly focus more on 4K 24 FPS in the future, and of course it's also helpful that you can find the bit rates of the different settings online for the DJI Mavic Air, which is not the case for every camera. I will link the list for the DJI Mavic Air down below, so that you can have a look for yourselves if you are interested. But for example, for the Nikon Z6, there's no way of finding the bit rates for the different settings. It's a little bit annoying, so I don't know how much I'm losing when going to a higher frames per second or when changing resolutions. I only know the maximum possible bitrate of this camera, but not much more, to be honest. Now, I won't say that this goes for every camera. I haven't tested every camera. In theory, if you're using the same codec, calculating the megabit per frame should give you the best picture quality. And this obviously was a correct assumption for the DJI Mavic Air. But if it's the correct assumption for other cameras, I cannot say for sure. So the conclusion is basically higher megabits per frame will give you a better picture quality. So that's all for this video. I hope it was helpful. If it was, give it a like. Thank you very much for watching, and see you again next time. Bye bye.